So you're 5 years apart? The young delinquent. All right. All right, so good morning. Geshe is away at Sydney, celebrating the Tibetan New Year with some friends, and I think that he's supposed to be in tomorrow, although, you know, with the current weather event and all other things that are happening, then I guess that we're just open to surprises and unexpected things happening. So of course, it's likely the case that he's going to be back with us soon. But in the meantime, I stepped in for leading this session, and he'll hopefully be back by Sunday teaching the Sunday morning session. So no, we had the Tibetan New Year happening yesterday, and it's an interesting thing. It's I'm never sure about what we're supposed to do for the Tibetan New Year, in that Tibetan New Year is a Tibetan thing, basically. It's Tibetan culture. It's not a religious holiday, although Tibetan people are pretty religious and pretty devout. So of course, it seems that it's hard to find a Tibetan celebration where there is nothing whatsoever happening with Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism and culture are so intertwined that, you know, some of the ways of celebrating the New Year also involved with a religious practice, but it's not one of the Buddhist holidays. So normally in the Tibetan New Year, Tibetans just want to kick back and relax. You know, so it's a very much family-oriented holidays. So in Tibetan lay society, you start preparing for the New Year a day or two, actually maybe a week before. So everyone is preparing new clothes a day or two before. Everyone cleans the house. There is that popular belief that if you start the new year with wearing a new set of clothes and everything is fresh, the house is clean, the food is very well prepared in abundance, then that would be a token of auspiciousness, symbolizing that in the next few weeks and months, you'll have everything new and abundant for you. So normally in the first day of Losar, people stay at home in the family unit, kind of, you don't go out and visit friends. You might go sometimes to see one of your close friends, but you pretty much stay within your family unit. Then the second and third day, then you're inviting others, you're being invited. In the second or third day, you start going to see lamas, one of your, those your spiritual teachers, and you make offerings to them. And I think that originally in Tibet, the whole Losar celebration, the New Year took, if not a month, then at least 2 weeks. So 2 weeks New Year holidays where you binge on atrocious food. Basically, Tibetans love the food, but the food is awful, really awful. So you do it for 2 weeks, and if you're in a monastery, then you just let your spiritual hair down, so to speak. So of course you don't drink alcohol when you're in a monastery, but you do get a couple of weeks break. So every once in a while, of course, there are pujas, and there are pujas being conducted in the monasteries, but it's a time for people to wind down. So you find that, some of the monks are kind of hanging out, playing cards, having lots of food, and, sing songs and so forth. Although, this is not what, like you could say, normal monks should do or nuns should be doing. Still, it's a very kind of, relaxed time, to feel quite at home in the family, in the monastery. So this is what Tibetans do. Now, in previous years, then people thought that Losar, maybe it's a religious holiday, so we should kind of be really religious and devout about it. So people here were taking precepts, asking the geshes to give precepts and so forth. And I remember that with the previous geshe that I worked with, Geshe Jaming, it was like always a bit uncomfortable about it. You know, someone is asking him to give precepts. And it's always good to take precepts. It's a virtuous thing, but at the same time, it's time for Tibetans to kick back and relax, you know, rather than being kind of really pristine and austere and so forth. It's really time to kick back and relax. It's not that it's not possible to do both of them, but it's not a religious holiday per se. Anyway, so we had a massive Lhasa celebration yesterday here with lots of offering. It was pretty beautiful. So I guess that I thought it's quite nice. We have no Tibetans around here that celebrate Lhasa with us, so we do it for them, but we do it our ways, you know. So there's, I guess, in terms of making offerings and or doing prayers or doing practices, taking precepts and so forth. Any day is a good day. You know, it's not that even if Tibetans are, it's not that if Tibetans are not doing it, then we shouldn't be doing it. You know, if we're making something good out of it, why not? But anyway, kind of sometimes I look around and think that I don't really know what we're supposed to be doing, or if I want to say that's the right way of doing it. But anyway, any day is a good day for creating virtue. So Geshe-la, I started with all of this just to say that Geshe-la is away, celebrating Tibetan Lhasa, the Tibetan New Year, with his friends, and I guess maybe some relatives at Sydney. He's going to come back tomorrow, hopefully. So when I thought of what we can do today, I thought of doing something in the spirit of the Stairs of the Path of Enlightenment, the Lamrim. Geshe-la currently is looking at the Stairs of the Path of practitioners of the Great Scope. And we've just been looking at Bodhichitta, the Mind of Enlightenment. So I thought of starting with just a review of this Lamrim tradition, or what the orientation is of the Lamrim tradition, and then to look at how we use refuge within the Lamrim practice. So this is what I thought of doing today. But before we do that, it's good to just maybe start a session with reciting the verse for refuge and Bodhichitta. So we'll do it now, although I was planning to speak of refuge more later on. It's still good to start a session with refuge and Bodhichitta as a way of, first of all, turning this session to be a Buddhist engagement with a motivation of refuge, and also to be a Mahayana engagement, a Mahayana practice with the last two lines, in which we think that maybe by discussing this material, thinking of this material, maybe turning a mind towards the Mahayana mind training, Mahayana mind generation, then also just listening to the teachings will be something that will be included in our creation of virtues included in the Mahayana. So just taking maybe just 30 seconds just to calm a mind before we recite the verse. So you can just make sure that your body is rested, that you feel at ease. If you can keep your back upright, not too rigid, not too tense, but just upright. And take 2 or 3 deep breaths. Then in thinking that we're trying to make our mind perfect, the best that it can be, in a process that extends over many lifetimes, in which bit by bit, we reduce our afflictive emotions. We develop more knowledge, love, compassion, patience, ethics, become more generous with ourselves and others. We're doing so in following the footsteps of the Buddha, the teacher, teachings that the Buddha gave. in the spiritual community that is helping us to develop our mind by giving us teachings and setting an example for us in broadening our horizons. So we completely put our trust in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha in order to attain our own future Buddhahood, to develop true paths and true cessations in our mind stream, and to become a Sangha member ourselves, someone that has an insight into reality that can lead others in this, along the stairs of developing their mind for the benefit of all living beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma or practicing generosity, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. All right. By the way, kind of as I started to speak about Losar, I just remembered that some 15 years ago, I went to, my teacher was staying on an island called Pudoshan in the southern China Sea, somewhere south of Shanghai. It's a place that is holy to Chenrezig, Avalokiteshvara. He was doing a 1.5 years retreat on that place. And he called me up one day and said, why don't I join him for Losar for the Tibetan New Year? So in my mind, I thought this is excellent. You know, it's going to be really romantic, you know, spending some time with my teacher and a couple of other of his close students. Some of his family members were joining him on that time and on that island, which is really beautiful. So I had in my mind kind of that idea is going to be great. So I traveled to China, made my way to Pudoshan, met him. Then when we celebrated the Tibetan New Year, I had a completely different experience to what I thought it would be. So for Tibetans, it's a time for really relaxing, not doing much. And as I said, it's a very family-oriented holiday. So for the first 2 or 3 days, there was an expectation that no one is going to leave home. Like basically you don't leave home. You need to spend some time with your family. So we were staying in a really small apartment, like 2-bedroom apartment, small kitchen, 1 toilet with like 10 people, 3 days of not going out. I was going stir crazy. But not only that, kind of they were playing for like 10 hours every day, Tibetan music, which is horrible. It's like, hello, how are you? Yeah, please. Yeah. Which is horrible. It's like, no. So I think that they had a great time. I thought I'd just let me out of here. Anyway, so let's speak about the Lamrim. So the Lamrim tradition started off by Atisha, which was an Indian scholar along, I guess, the 10th or 11th century. An Indian scholar that made his way from Tibet, from India to Tibet. And there's a very traditional story telling how Atisha came to travel to Tibet. He was invited by a king that was reigning at the time in the western part of Tibet. So the first wave of dissemination of Buddhism in Tibet has already occurred. But then things went sideways. Buddhism did not take a very firm root in Tibet. The old tradition was still, I guess, alive and active in many different areas in Tibet. So Buddhism went into, I guess, a phase of some declination, but it is likely that it still exists in some parts of Tibet at the time, because then when Atisha went to Tibet, he went to Tibet on a request of one of the kings that were reigning in the west of Tibet. And, you know, as the story tells you, kind of on the way to Tibet, he composed the first Lamrim text. So he composed the first Lamrim text and he sent it back to India. And the people in his monastery, the Nanda monastery, found the text to be pertinent, an excellent text. So the Lamrim, which means the success of the path of enlightenment, is a tradition which takes the different teachings that the Buddha gave, but puts them in a different order, in a very particular order. And when I say in a different order, it means that different to the way that the Buddha taught the teachings originally. In that the Buddha became a Buddha when he was, I think, 35 years old, passed away when he was 81, which means 45, 46 years of teachings. Now, the Buddha gave teachings at different places in India to different audiences. So obviously, you know, having 45 years of teaching Dharma to 40, you know, to different types of audiences, gaining momentum, amassing disciples and so forth. The Buddha was dealing with different circumstances of different people. So then later on, when those teachings were collated based on the memory of people, you know, those teachings were not put into writing straight away, but they were put into writing, I think, after, at least as the story goes, after the Buddha passed away, when people thought that they need to have a system that documents and retains the teachings of the Buddha, then it was put into writing. But it was said that the Buddha did it in 3 phases, which are called the 3 turnings of the wheel. And the analogy of the wheel is used in order to kind of illustrate the moving of the Dharma from the Buddha's mind to living being's mind, to the disciple's mind, in the same way that a chariot that travels on wheels is traveling from point A to point B. So the 3 turnings of the wheel, the 3 sets of teachings that the Buddha gave. First off, the Buddha, at least in the traditional story, started to teach 49 days after he became enlightened. He gave teachings on the 4 truths, which are called often the 4 noble truths. There are 4 truths for those advanced practitioners called Arya beings. And the Buddha spoke of true suffering, true origins, true cessation, true paths. And everything that the Buddha said after that belongs to the 4 truths, in a sense that it comes under the big umbrella of the 4 truths. It's like a really detailed explanation of the 4 truths. There's nothing that falls outside of the parameters of the 4 truths. So it's not that the Buddha gave only 1 teachings on the 4 truths. The first turning of the wheel, which means that this first set of teachings, which took, I don't know how many years, but it is likely that it was over a certain period of time, a few weeks, months, years, I don't know, maybe a few decades, I have no idea. The Buddha gave teachings on the 4 truths. So there are many sutras that are included in those sets of teachings. Then in the second phase of teachings, the Buddha was in Rajgir, which was, Rajgir is the word for a king's court in a kingdom called Magadha. So for those of you who've been to India, those of you who've been to Bodh Gaya and been to Vajrapeak at Bodh Gaya, you climb onto this mountain, which is actually, I guess, is medium hill. It's not a real mountain, is it? It's not, all right. So no, it's not like it's not the Alps. It's a hill, but you can see kind of many different hills around, like medium-sized hills, and you look at the valleys around, and you know it used to be the kingdom Magadha. It was outside of the main court of the king. The Buddha was there at the time teaching discourses that belong to what we call the second turning of the wheel, in which on those discourses, the Buddha gave teachings on the perfection of wisdom, teaching the ultimate view of reality. So first off, in the first turning of the wheel, the Buddha taught through suffering, true origins, but then the second pair of truths, true cessations and true paths, we're dealing with how to develop in true path and insight into reality in order to bring about true cessations in which we put a stop to suffering and the cause of suffering. So the Buddha gave an elaborated explanation on what it means to develop true paths and mainly true cessations in the second turning of the wheel. You develop true paths in observing reality, emptiness, selflessness. So he gave, he taught a sutra that is called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra in 100,000 verses. Then another one, which is more condensed in 25,000 verses, another one in 8,000 verses. He taught the Heart Sutra, he taught the Diamond Kata Sutra. He gave teachings, different sets of teachings on the meaning of emptiness, which you can say is more tending towards the second pair of the two truths. Now, one interesting thing with respect to the second turning of the wheel is that the Buddha said that when we look at whatever exists, all phenomena, then no phenomena exist objectively. This is what we need to realize. There is no objective existence. Now, there are many different terms in Buddhist tradition for describing that reality, which is absent of objective existence. So we used terms such as there's no inherent existence, no objective existence, no true existence, no existence by way of phenomena's own characteristics, no existence by its own essence, all of not existing by one's own mode of subsistence and so forth. Many different terms which maybe shine a light on different perspectives, but they all mean the same thing, that there is no objective existence. But then if we go back to the first turning of the wheel, the Buddha said that something different in the first turning of the wheel. He said that phenomena do exist objectively. They do exist by way of their own characteristics. So it seems that there is like a massive contradiction between teachings that were given in the first turning of the wheel and the second turning of the wheel. So one thing to keep in mind is that there was that initial audience that was there at the time of the first turning of the wheel. They were ripe for one set of teachings. A few years later, the audience was much greater. There were more advanced practitioners present in those teachings, as well as beings that came from other worlds, in kind of this, in the common story told about the second turning of the wheel. But anyway, since there was this seeming massive contradiction between what the Buddha said in the first and second turnings of the wheel, then some people, at least in the story, in the way that Tibetans tell it, some people approached the Buddha and said, what's the deal here? You know, what's the story? First, he said that whatever exists, exists objectively. Then he said that whatever exists, nothing exists objectively. So in the third turning of the wheel, which again was given for some disciples, the Buddha said, actually, when we look at everything that exists, we can divide it into three categories. Some exist by way of their own characteristics, which means that some have objective existence, some do not exist objectively. So the Buddha taught that the main sutra that is used in order to explain that set of teaching is called the Sutra Unraveling the Thought. But there are other things that were taught in the third turning of the wheel, such as Buddha nature, that all of us have a Buddha nature, all of us can become Buddhas. So these are the three turnings of the wheel. Now, in the way that Tibetans refer to the teachings of the Buddha, they say that the Buddha gave 84,000 sets of teachings or discourses. It's a really nice number, right? 84,000. We also have the 84,000 project, which is endeavoring to translate the Kangyur, the set of teachings that the Buddha gave, into English from many from the Tibetan language. So now we have the Kangyur here on the altar. Now I always kind of wonder if we open all the volumes of the Kangyur and we list down all the teachings, if indeed we'll arrive at 84 discourses. Maybe a discourse is not just one sutra, but maybe a sutra can consist of many discourses, so that if we enumerate them, maybe there is a way of coming up with 84,000 teachings. But also it is said that those 84,000 teachings are addressing 84,000 afflictions that are present in our mind stream, which is quite a big number when we think of our mind. Now, our mind can be petty. It can have anger, attachment, pride, jealousy, competitiveness, pretension, and other afflictive states of mind. But 84,000 afflictions sounds pretty massive endeavor to eliminate all of them. I mean, we also need to keep in mind that there are afflictions that belong to other realms of existence, which we do not experience at the moment. And that, for example, if you're born as a fish, you don't experience the afflictions that you have as a human being, right? When you're born as a dog, you don't experience the same disturbing emotions that we experience as human beings, and vice versa. So it's not kind of unlikely that we do have actually in our mind stream this massive array of disturbing emotions, which exist in all forms of existence in samsara. Anyway, so the Buddha gave 84,000 discourses, which is an awful lot of teachings to study if we want to completely eliminate our afflictions and fully develop the potential of our mind. So then, in the second turning of the wheel, though the Buddha gave teachings mainly on emptiness, on the absence of objective existence, it is said that in a hidden manner, the Buddha taught the steps of the path to enlightenment. Now, there's another text that is called the Ornament for Clear Realization, which was authored by a being called Maitreya. In this text, the Ornament of Clear Realization is teaching those things which were taught in a hidden manner in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra explicitly teach emptiness. Implicitly, they teach us what to do in order to get to the realization of emptiness and use that in order to become Buddhas. So Maitreya extracted those hidden teachings and arranged them in a text that consists of 8 chapters. It's called the Ornament for Clear Realization. And Atisha used mainly that text in order to, again, put another spin on the steps of the path of enlightenment. And he arranged them in a way that is easy for one person to understand what they need to do from the very beginning all the way to the end, to the attainment of the state of Buddhahood. So if you work with the Ornament of Clear Realization, it's not an easy text. It's a massive text. In a traditional Tibetan monastery, it takes probably 7 or 8 years to study this text. And the way that they study is way more intense than what we do here. In that, in your life as a monk, monk or a nun in one of those monasteries, or nunneries, then you wake up early in the morning, you go to prayers, then you have breakfast, then you take classes, or you go to a debate session. Then in the morning you do your own self-study. In the evening, can you have a very long debate session? You might have more classes happening in between. You do memorization after that and or between. So it's quite full on. It's a whole day thing, and at least the study of the Ornament of Clear Realization takes about 7 or 8 years, or maybe more. Dependent on the monastery, I reckon. And so for us, it's pretty hard to learn that in great details. So Atisha took mainly the Ornament for Clear Realization and many other texts as well, and he then reshuffled the whole set of teachings. So the Ornament of Clear Realization is already shuffling the teachings that the Buddha gave. Then there is another shuffle that is taking place, which is in Atisha's Steps of the Path of Enlightenment. So the text is called The Lamp on the Path of Enlightenment. So Atisha went to Tibet. Then after Atisha, or with the going of Atisha to Tibet, a new tradition came into existence in Tibet, which is called the Kadampa Tradition. Now, the Kadampa Tradition, I guess if I look at the etymology of the words in Tibetan, refers to those practitioners, those masters that have taken the teachings that the Buddha gave, the words of the Buddha, and have committed to them seriously. So they were kind of strict, holy, very true to the teachings that the Buddha gave and practiced them in earnest. So after Atisha came other Kadampa masters, Rom Tumba and Lamrim Tradition and Geshe Cheko and Poto and so forth, and they set the scene for the second wave of renaissance in the teachings of the Buddha in Tibet. Right? So the first tradition that evolved in Tibet is called the Ningman Tradition. The word Ningman means old, right? So that's the original or the old tradition, the first tradition, the Ningman Tradition. Then in the second dissemination of teachings in Tibet, the Kagyu tradition has evolved. The Sakya tradition has also evolved. I don't know at which point in time. I don't have the historical figures, but no, it's very much a family lineage, the Sakya tradition. And then there was another reshuffle in Tibetan Buddhism that occurred in Tibet, probably about 300 years after Atisha went to Tibet with the writings of the Cess of the Path to Enlightenment. So in the 14th century, Lama Tsongkhapa was born in the east of Tibet. Then he made his way from the east of Tibet to the center of Tibet. And again, he reshuffled, you can say, the teachings of the Buddha in Tibet. When I say he reshuffled, it's not that he, again, created something that is completely new. I think that probably he brought about a greater system is the word, is it a word, systemization? Anyway, I made up a word, systemization. Let's use that. Let's put it in our dictionary. So anyway, he created, he took what Atisha did in his Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, and he created a massive commentary system to Atisha's Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. So he wrote a text that is called the Lamrim Chemo. He wrote the Middling Lamrim, which is what we study here on the Friday morning session. He wrote an abridged version of Lamrim, and he wrote a few other Lamrim texts. But he wasn't the only one who did it. Also, looking at the masters that came after Lama Tsongkhapa, we have masters such as Pabonka Rinpoche, one of the Panchen Lamas. They also created their own commentaries to the Stairs of the Path to Enlightenment. But also, Atisha's Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment exists in other forms. You know, the commentary system exists in other forms in other traditions. So you find, for example, the jewel Ornament of Liberation that was composed by Gampopa in the Kagyu tradition. This is, you can say, maybe a sort of, it's not an actual equivalent of the Lamrim Chemo, but you can say that it's also another text of another tradition of taking the teachings of the Buddha, taking some of the writings of Atisha, taking writings of other masters, and arranging them in a certain fashion that teaches one individual what they need to do from the very beginning all the way to the end. So we speak in the Lamrim tradition about the steps of the path of beings from the three scopes, the small, the medium, and great scopes. And on the surface, it seems as if we're speaking about different people. You have those that are small scope, those that are medium scope, those that are great scope. But actually, it is made very clear at the beginning of the text that rather than speaking of three different people, it is actually one set of instructions that is targeting one person along the steps of development. So the way that it works in Tibetan is speaking of a kind of, when you look at the words themselves, that describe those stages, they say that let's first of all deal with a small person, then a medium person, and then a large person, which kind of makes it really difficult to translate that sentiment into English. So it's not about kind of, you know, often Tibetans say, Tibetan masters say that it's not about your body size or kind of, you know, being a larger than life personality, so to speak. It's more of looking at how vast and extensive you can make your scope. Your scope can be made. And that first off, in your first stage of development, when you're starting to make your mind more vast and extensive, you're looking at not at what will happen to you in this life, but what will happen to you in your next lifetime. Which then, first off, sets the stage for our understanding that we use the Buddhist tradition not primarily to make this lifetime easier, although it's not a bad thing. I mean, it's good to make this lifetime easier. It's good to make this lifetime more comfortable. We want to make a mind be more at peace, healthier in this lifetime. And you can say that we can use Buddhist techniques in order to do it. But it's good to understand that this is not the main reason that the Buddha gave teachings. So the first stage of changing our orientation is thinking of what will happen to us in future lifetimes. So if we then focus on what will happen to us on future lifetimes, it will also have an effect on what we do with our life in this lifetime. It's more of a powerful reorganizing of our priorities rather than focusing only on this life. We start to think of future lifetimes, and it has a rippling effect over what we do in this life, obviously. So then that's the first phase of broadening our perspective. The second phase is thinking of not only about what will happen to us in our future life, but also about this unending cycle of birth and death and birth and death, in which we have no control over that process. Even if we don't wish to, we take another rebirth. And although in general we say that no one wishes to die, I mean, living inside the fact that some people actually do want to die, but I guess that when people have kind of suicidal thoughts or kind of really strong pain, they carry strong pain, it is sometimes carried with the belief that there is only one life. But from a Buddhist perspective, then you die and then take another rebirth. The story is not over. So this cycle of birth and death, and a lot of experiences, many of them are painful in between. Now what runs through all of them is the basis, which is just not good enough. It's not satisfactory. A basis which conditions us to the experience of suffering in this lifetime as well as in future lifetimes. So in the second phase of changing our mind, we look at that massive process of birth and death in all forms of rebirth in cyclic existence and decide that this is, again, not good enough. So we then develop the wish to completely leave that cycle of birth and death and attend a state of liberation, which is attained in our own mind. When the mind becomes free of disturbing emotions, we're no longer compelled to continue with that cycle of birth and death. So liberation happens on a mental level. That's the second phase of making our mind become more vast and spacious. And then in the third phase, we start to look at those around us and see that all of us are in the same story. Now, sometimes we get a better situation, a situation that is better than others. There are so many people that are in a way worse situation than our situation at the moment. And in other situations, our state is much worse than others, right? So there are always people that do better than us and always people that do worse than us. So we recognize the equality of all of us in terms of all of us are going through highs and lows, through states of uncertainty for time on end, or without end, sorry, since time without beginning and up until now, and also for a very long time in the future. So then we develop the wish not only to liberate ourselves from this cycle of birth and death, but to liberate everyone, in recognizing also that everyone has the potential to do it. In a sense that, of course, when you look at dogs and cats and fish and water dragons or what have you, in their state of existence, in that particular state of existence, they don't have much potential for developing their mind. But in the future, when they die and they are born again as human beings, if they have circumstances in which they can meet the Dharma and practice the Dharma and so forth, they will have the potential for developing their mind. So then in recognizing that, we make a larger step in developing our mind, in opening our mind to thinking that in the future, I want to become Buddha in order to reach out to whoever is open to developing the mind in order to become liberated or to become Buddha. So those three stages of development are presented in the Lamrim tradition. So when we then go back to the earlier stages of the path, those of the small scope, the topic of refuge is taught in the small scope. So the way that refuge is taught is in the following way. First off, when you look at the beginning point of the Lamrim tradition, it starts with the way to rely upon a spiritual teacher, which you can say that it is a preliminary, it's a precursor to the steps of the path of those of the three scopes. It's a precursor. Now, it's also interesting because we also keep in mind that the Lamrim tradition was taught for Buddhists. Although for ourselves who came outside of the Buddhist tradition, we're kind of new students to the Buddhist tradition, often we begin with the Lamrim. I think that originally the Lamrim was not designed for non-Buddhists. It was designed for Buddhists, in that you are already considering yourself Buddhist. You already have some trust in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. You already have some trust in the existence of past and future lifetimes. So the orientation of the beginning point is slightly different. But anyway, this is what we have from the Buddhist tradition. We try to make our best out of it, right? So even though it is some of the points are not totally suited for our disposition, it's still, I guess, there are more positives than negatives in this tradition. So we begin with the way to rely upon a spiritual teacher in the teaching of the Lamrim, and it basically says that if you want to make the most out of your potential, you need to find a qualified teacher to teach you how to do it. Once you verify that the teacher is a qualified teacher, that also you from your side, that you're a qualified student, and you understand very well what is the meaning of relying upon a spiritual teacher, which means that there are some responsibilities of the teacher, but also you have a responsibility as a student. So it's there are kind of two sides to that story of relying upon a spiritual teacher. And also the main thing in relying upon a spiritual teacher is that you listen to teachings, you get instructions, and then your role is to put them into practice. That's your main role. That's the first topic that is taught in this text. And then it says that let's look at our life now. It says that we have a precious human rebirth. It means that we have externally very favorable conditions. We have spiritual teachers, the teachings of the Buddha are available to us. We have, at least when we look at ourselves, we live in an affluent place. We enjoy very good living conditions comparing to other places around the world. Of course, now, it's not that everyone around us does experience that state of abundance, particularly now, kind of when we think of the recent floods, or I don't know, some people's financial situation in the fallout of COVID and so forth. I mean, some people find themselves in really dire situations, so you can be living in an affluent place, but be completely dispossessed, right? So, but in general, you can say that our support system, even if you find yourself in a state that is really dire, our support system is better than the support systems in other places. So anyway, we recognize first of all that externally, relatively speaking, our situation is okay, or we can even take the next step. It's a good situation. Then internally, and this is even more important, we have excellent conditions for developing our mind. So we were not born in states of existence that would inhibit our spiritual development. We were not born as animals and so forth. We don't have really strong wrong views that completely prevent us from developing our mind. We don't have certain physical or mental disabilities that make it impossible for us to develop our mind. I mean, this is actually pretty interesting. The word that is used in Tibetan to describe that is connected with either deafness or being mute. And when we think of, when I look at what I know from Tibetan society in terms of being able to take care of people that have physical or mental disabilities, I guess that they're still behind to a great extent than what our society at the present can offer people that have disabilities. So basically, if you were born blind or deaf or incapable of speaking, then your options of developing your mind were quite limited. The same word is sometimes used also to refer to mental disability, in which your mind is not smart enough, or you can say dull, which again prevents you from developing your mind. But I think that rather than looking down on people that kind of were either mentally disabled or had physical disabilities, basically if I look in general at this description, kind of in some point in time along centuries, in some cultures, traditions, and so forth, if you had certain problems, you didn't have access to education, you didn't have access to teachers, you didn't have access for methods for developing your mind, and also there wasn't any occupational therapy available for people for, I guess, most periods of time along history. So we don't have that for the moment for us. And even if we do have now certain physical or mental situations that make it difficult, our situation is much better in comparison with previous centuries. I mean, now if you're born blind or deaf, you can still develop your mind. There are ways that we can reach out to people and ways in which you can reach out to others. So we recognize the potential that we have now for developing our mind. That's the main point. And then when you recognize that, you think, I have a precious human rebirth. It is of great advantage. I can do great with my ability to develop my mind, but my time is very limited. Not only my time is very limited, also it's very difficult to find this opportunity again. It's very difficult to find, again, a precious human rebirth. So we then start to think of death and impermanence in that, first off, death is certain, and every year, month, week, day, hour, minute, second, and so forth is getting us closer and closer to the moment of death, and that we have no guarantee that we will actually live to old age. Death can come at any time now, and that at the time of death, we'll have to say goodbye to all the things that we are holding on to now with such great fear of being separated from. None of them will continue with us from this life to the next. So our friends and relatives will be left behind. In that sense, the Buddhist tradition says we are born alone and we die alone. It's pretty kind of, when you think about it, it sounds pretty cold and cruel, isn't it? We are born alone and die alone. I mean, we are born and we are being cuddled straight away by a mother, and we are taken care of greatly by our parents and family members and friends and so forth as we grow up. And then when we pass away, when we get old, most of us have people around us that can take care of us to a certain degree, either family members or even you can say in old age house or in in certain facilities. There's still people that take care of us, but the subjective experience that we have on a mental level is that when we are born into this world, we are born with our mind into a body that is completely new. We as developing babies and so forth, we have other people to take care of us, but it's very difficult for them to really understand what's happening to us on a mental level as babies. So in that sense, we are born alone. No one can really understand what's going on in our mind. They can read our body language, but that's about it. But also when we die alone, in a sense that even if we are surrounded by people that are very dear to us, we'll have to leave all of them behind. We have to leave all of them behind. None of them can join us after, in the moment of death and after the moment of death. And also all the different things that we have collected in our life that have a great sentimental value for us. I mean, I'm not speaking about money. Of course, money is one of the things that we kind of really focus on in this life, money, possessions, and so forth, but just things that for us have greater significance in this life, old photos, things that belong to our parents, things that one person that is really dear to our heart gave us at some point in time. None of them will continue with us from this lifetime to the next. I mean, it kind of reminds me that when my mom passed away in 2008, and my dad passed away 3 years after that. And my dad, I guess that also my mom, both of them, although they passed away in the hospital, you can say that they passed away in the house that they lived in for more than 40 years. That's the apartment that I grew up in, and it really kind of one of those boring, non-descriptive suburbs, pretty beige, basically. But anyway, after my father passed away, I had to go back home to Israel and take care of the possessions, prepare the apartment to be put on the market. And I had to work through just piles of garbage, basically. It's terrible to say that, but it was, for them, some of those things held some sentimental value, some recollections, old photos and so forth of worlds that do not exist anymore. And I had to go through many of the things in a short period of time and just basically decide what I put in big garbage bags, and which things I give to others as like things that again hold some sentimental value, which again will be chucked away in the future by someone else, or be given or be donated or gifted to someone else. So the same thing will happen to us, right? Now I came back from the trip to Israel and looked at my stuff and basically chucked out half of the things that I had. And recently I had to do it again, so it's quite a nice exercise to think of things that we hoard, that we hold on to, and then be able to kind of think that actually, if I have to be separated from them at some point in time, at least now I have control. I can open my mind and give them away to others before someone else decides to do it for me. So we cannot take the things that are due to us with us. And also, we cannot take our body with us. Also, the body is being left behind. And this is the most difficult thing to do, to think of being separated from our body. What would it be like for the connection between our body and mind to be separated? Because for most of our life, our identity is based on our body. Now, when we think of who we are as human beings, we have such a great identification with the body. First of all, we have our own gender identity. I mean, now we live at a time which is actually quite great with gender fluidity, kind of. So when I said that it's quite great, kind of, I think that it's quite nice to think of how we're find ways to break free from some of the things that constrained our mind. I mean, of course, someone that does go through a process of kind of gender fluidity, probably it's not an easy process. It's quite difficult process for them, but kind of, I think that in general for us as society to think of how our identity is not necessarily only based on gender, and also that can also change, is actually quite great. So no, we have gender identity, we have ethnic identity, we have I guess a linguistic identity, we have a social identity, where we are and how we are and who we are in relation to others. So that is mostly related to our body, sometimes also to qualities of our mind, but pretty much based on the body that we have. So when we pass away, we also have to be separated from that identity as well. So, and this is really difficult. So then in the steps of the path to enlightenment, Lama Tsongkhapa says, now consider what will happen to you after that threshold of moving from this lifetime to the next. So from a Buddhist perspective, it's not that everything will cease to exist, but we go on and take another rebirth. So then in thinking of what will happen to me after that, we use reasons and logic in order to think of going from this lifetime to the next. And of course, some people have I think, a natural belief, maybe we can say, kind of, that comes through imprints of, in the existence of future lifetimes. I didn't grow up in this tradition. It wasn't my thing to think of existence of future lifetimes. Now, kind of, I think that I very much agree with the existence of future lifetimes, but I guess that not to the same certainty and extent that my Tibetan friends accept it, growing up in such culture or tradition. But still, for me, kind of now it seems like very likely to happen. Anyway, so Lama Tsongkhapa says, think of what will occur to you in the future. What would be your fate? Are you going to have a good state of rebirth or a miserable state of rebirth? So then when we look at miserable states of rebirth, of course, there are many states of rebirth that can take place, hellish states of existence, preta states of existence. But what we can see is what will it be like to be born as an animal. So when I think of what would be like to be born as an animal, and particularly now that we have an access to documentaries of National Geographics and articles and textbooks and documentaries or what have you, it says that it's not a good deal. It's if you're born as if you're born as an animal, it's pretty terrible. I mean, apart from just kind of, it seems that the day-to-day experience is quite terrifying. Even if you live as a pet in a wealthy house, it seems that kind of your physical makeup, your brain makeup and mind makeup is still such that you're conditioned to being fearful quite often, kind of you're always on alert. So then we start to think of how it would be for us to be born in that state of existence. So rather than looking at that from the inside to the outside and looking at animals around us and thinking, oh, this is so sad, this is so difficult, and so forth, we think of how it would be like for me to be put in the shoes of the legs or what have you, in that crust or shell of that animal. How will I look at the world around me from that vantage point? Like, if you think of yourself as a porcupine or, as a platypus or a giraffe or as a cicada and so forth, how will my world look like around me? First of all, will there be fear in my mind? Will I be hunted? Will I be preyed upon by other living beings? And also, what will my concern be in that? And of course, it's difficult to kind of think about the state of mind using the conceptualization process that we have now as human beings, but you can still kind of gauge to a certain degree whether your mind will be smart or whether it would be quite limited. So it is likely that the mind would be very limited in terms of understanding and also knowing what we need to do in order to find greater protection, in order to work out what we need to do that exceeds just taking care of our day-to-day needs. What we need to do in order to develop our mind. Of course, there would be no spirituality whatsoever. And so we think that this is not what I want. This is definitely not a state that I want to be in. And then Lama Tsongkhapa presents the topic of going for refuge. And he says the first cause for going for refuge is fear, which is an interesting kind of presentation, because I think that many of us, at least when I think of myself, growing up in a secular family, but still, kind of belonging to a certain culture, so Jewish culture. But I think that also here now, when we think of Christian culture, Christian background, I think that many people don't want to base their spiritual practice on fear. Fear feels like an outdated approach to religion. No, we don't want to be terrorized. We don't want to be pushed into a spiritual practice in telling us that if you're not going to do that, you're going to go to hell, or that God will punish you, or that Buddha will punish you, or that this will punish you. We don't want to look at it like that because it seems totally outdated. But still, when you look at the presentation of refuge, it is said that the first cause for going for refuge is fear. So I think that we need to kind of make an effort in order to understand what that fear means and to find the motivation ourselves to go for refuge. So in the same way that we think, I think now that when we live in a system in which if we don't take care of our future, if we don't put some money in a superannuation, if we don't have enough money to get by, if we don't take care of our physical well-being, we know that there could be difficult repercussions in the future. So now it's not that we are completely obsessed with fear, but we still think that this is not what I want to experience when I get old, and therefore now I exercise. Now I try to take care of my body as much as I can. Now I put some money aside for rainy days. Now I put some money into my superannuation fund so that I would be able to have a more comfortable life when I grow old and so forth. So you can say in some sense that it is a type of fear. It's not a debilitating type of fear that makes you incapable of doing anything about your situation, but it is a type of fear that makes you take informed decisions. And some of them are very good decisions. So in the same way, when we think of refuge, we think of not fear that will terrorize you, that makes us incapable of doing stuff, but the one that will motivate us or push us to do something about our current situation. So the first type of fear that we think of is what will occur to us in future lifetimes. We think that this is not what I want to end in, being born as a dog, a cat, a dolphin, a platypus, or whatever, what have you, a dodo, a kiwi. So no, this is not what I want to be born in. And then we think that at the time that I have left in this life, I can do something about it, to prevent that type of rebirth. So that's the first type of fear that we have, fear of what will occur to us in future lifetime. And then the second cause for going for refuge is having faith that the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha have the ability to protect us from that type of fear. But again, when we think of them having the ability to protect us, it's not that the protection will come from their side, like a type of protection that we seek, I think, when we think of theistic religion, in that, sometimes I think that in a very simplistic way, maybe, I guess that if you look deeply at other religions, theistic religions, it's not necessarily the case, but often it seems that if you behave well, then you're rewarded by God. If you don't behave well, you will be punished by God. I guess that when you speak to kind of a deep practitioner, a deep philosopher, there's much more into that rather than keeping it in a simple level like that. But the point is that when you trust that the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha have the ability to give you that protection, it's not like the protection that is similar to being punished or being rewarded. It's rather that from their side, they can teach you what you need to do. But from your side, if you don't do it, you don't protect yourself. The protection needs to come from your side based on teachings that came from them, instructions, advice, guidance that came from them. So again, it's like a bargain that has two sides. So this is where the topic of refuge comes within the presentation of the steps of the path of enlightenment. Then we go on to, it comes in the context of the small scope, in which we think of what will occur to me in my next lifetime. And then we move on to the medium scope, in which we think of what will occur to us in samsara, the cycle of birth and death. How do we break out of samsara? And then we move on to the steps of the path of the great scope, in thinking of, I want to become Buddha. But we don't really revisit our going for refuge again and again. So we mention it on the small scope, and it seems that the cause that you explained in the small scope is the fear of what will occur to us in our next lifetime. But then I think that when we then take on this explanation and try to remodel going for refuge, reshape our going for refuge in order to fit other scopes, we can start to work with that fear and make it a more extensive but also more informed type of fear, rather than just kind of thinking of what occurs to us in our next lifetime. We then develop fear of all the type of suffering in cyclic existence, and through that we go for refuge. And even more so, we think of how it'd be like to know that you can do something, you have a potential of doing something for others, for those who are dear to your heart, but currently don't have the skills to do it, and your time is running out. So suppose that, kind of when you think about it in terms of an analogy, suppose that one of your dear friends or family members is sick with a really serious condition, and you know there is a treatment, but you need to get that treatment quite soon. And you have to travel to a great extent. You have to go overseas and maybe spend a lot of money or your resources in order to get the treatment, but you're eager to do it in thinking that that will save the person that is close to my heart. So in the same way, when we think of the things that prevent us from becoming Buddhas, when we follow the steps of the path of the great scope, we think of those people that are close to our heart, that are going through a similar cycle like us in cyclic existence of birth and death. And we think that there is a solution out there. I know that there is a solution out there. And only if I become a Buddha, I'd be able then to help them in the most beneficial way, in the most extensive way for them to get out of that cycle of birth and death, and even more so to become Buddhas themselves. So there's that sense of urgency that you develop, which is involved with fear of not being able to do enough soon enough, to make that happen. So we use that form of fear in order to motivate ourselves to make the most out of this life, the most out of this year, this month, this week, this day, this hour, and so forth. So this is the type of fear that we have, and we also have the trust that the Buddha, the Dhamma, and Sangha have the ability to teach us what we need to do, or to support our practice in order to make that happen. So we take refuge in general when we think of those different types of fear, but we can also reshape our refuge to be a refuge in a particular Mahayana way if we think that our goal is to become Buddhas for the sake of others. So now we take refuge in the Buddha, but also what we take refuge in is the Mahayana Dharma, which means, first of all, the sets of teachings that teach us how to develop our mind in the most extensive way, in a quicker way, in a profound way, in a very deep way, but also the main type of Dhamma is the type of Dhamma that we develop in our own mind, true paths and true cessations, which are part of the Mahayana true paths and true cessations, which means that, first of all, how to develop compassion in our mind stream, to develop on that basis bodhicitta, and that bodhicitta taking us all the way to the development of insight into reality, direct realization of emptiness. That is the Mahayana true paths that we take refuge in, right? So realization of emptiness that is supported by bodhicitta, and also true cessations that will be brought about through the direct realization of emptiness. And we also take refuge in the Mahayana Sangha. Mahayana Sangha meaning Arya Bodhisattvas, mainly. Of course, when we think of our spiritual teachers in this organization or outside of this organization, we mainly take refuge also in our spiritual teachers, in thinking of them as, if not Buddhas, then at least you can say as Arya Bodhisattvas in a sense, or Sangha in general, in a sense that it's hard for us to see Buddha as Buddha directly. We think of other people as being Buddhas. Like now we try to think of the Dalai Lama as being Buddha, Lama Zopa Rinpoche as being Buddha. I mean, we try to think about him like that, but what we see in front of us, for most people, is just an ordinary person. So it's pretty hard to see them as Buddha because what appears to us is an ordinary person. But even if a Buddha appeared to us face to face, it is likely that we'll still see faults in that person. We'll still kind of see them as an ordinary person rather than a fully enlightened Buddha. So our spiritual teachers, you can say, appear to us as emissaries of the Buddhas, or Buddhas in actuality, but they communicate to us in a way that we can understand, being like someone that looks like an ordinary being. But for us, those who teach us the Buddha, they give us instructions for practice. They set an example for us, they inspire us, they act as people that we look up to. So these for us, you can say, are the Sangha, right? So Arya Bodhisattvas, the spiritual teachers that can be emanations of the Buddhas and emissaries of the Buddhas, Arya Bodhisattvas, Bodhisattvas in general, or what have you. So when we go for refuge, then we go also for refuge to them. So when we put the Lamrim into practice, we often in our meditation practice, we begin with refuge and bodhicitta. And then it should lead us to meditating on the steps of the path of enlightenment, which is interesting in terms of how you make your way back and forth in putting the Lamrim tradition into practice. When you put it into practice, you need to begin with, first of all, thinking of the small scope, then thinking of the medium scope, then thinking of the great scope. But if you want to start your practice with going for refuge, we often go for refuge in the Mahayana way, which means that we bring the great scope to the beginning of our practice. And only then we start meditating on the steps of the path of the small scope. So it can be really confusing, can't it? So at least the way that I think about it is, rather than sitting to a meditation practice and studying straight off with just reciting the verse for refuge and bodhicitta, I start first of all to meditate on the steps of path of the small scope and take the time to do it. So first of all, kind of I remind myself of having a precious human rebirth. Then I think of death and impermanence. Then I think of what will occur to me in my future lifetime. And even though now is the time to go for refuge, as you find the topic of refuge in the Lamrim, I don't necessarily go for refuge at this point in time. Then I start thinking of what will occur to me, even if I'm born in a good state of rebirth, how it's still not good enough. There's still problems and difficulties, and I have to do it again and again, and there's no certainty and no satisfaction, and yada, yada, yada. And you're starting now to develop the wish to emerge from cyclic existence. And then I add bodhicitta to it, compassion, bodhicitta, and with that, I go for refuge. So it seems that kind of it is somewhat, it feels like somewhat back to front. Refuge that should come at the beginning of the practice ends up at the end of the practice. I mean, maybe it's not at the very end of the practice, but it's somewhere in an advanced level of the practice. So no, I go for refuge. It is done together with bodhicitta. And then comes the practice of the 6 perfections. I think that the way that I look at a Lamrim practice, I think that it's suitable to do it. Well, does it sound awkward? So George is saying that when you go further along the path, then you can do it. Your refuge becomes stronger. Yeah, I think that you can do it, and I think that if you give yourself the breath and the kind of the time in your Lamrim practice, or spiritual practice in general, then you can build up your refuge motivation in general. But also another point that I have in mind concerning refuge is that in the same way that everything that the Buddha taught comes under the banner of the 4 truths, you can say that it's an extension of the 4 truths. You can also say a similar thing to a great extent with respect to refuge. Although refuge is found at the very beginning of our practice, still, when we put things into practice, we practice refuge. I mean, a practice will give us refuge from suffering in this life and future lifetime. So when we put into practice and when we meditate on death and impermanence, and this is a kind of reorganizing of our priorities, of our conscious, so to speak. We find out what's really important for us in this life and what's really incidental to us in this life as much as we can. When we think of the drawbacks of samsara, cyclic existence, we find it, and we find this meditation as a powerful tool for lowering the levels of attachment and anger and pride and so forth. When we develop compassion to others. all of this is honing the power of our refuge, in a sense that when we think of refuge as stuff which protects us from suffering and the causes of suffering, when we bring down the levels of anger, attachment, and so forth, when we desist from harming others, when we develop compassion towards others and so forth, we're developing internal protection, which means that this is, you can say, an actual refuge that we develop in our mind. So I think that I can relate to what you said, Georgie, that although although it's something that comes earlier in the teachings, going for refuge, still, when you go deeper into refuge, when your practice becomes deeper, then most of the things that we practice can come under the banner of going for refuge. So it's also found actually in very late stages of our practice. So then the last thing that I wanted to mention today with respect to the Lamrim and then going for refuge in a way that not only belongs to the states of the path of the small scope, but also is found in the medium and great scope, is then the way that we take on the states of the path of enlightenment as a daily practice. So in many teachings that we got before, our teachers said that you take this Lamrim meditation as a glance meditation, a daily meditation, which you review the steps of the path of enlightenment and you acquaint your mind thoroughly with the steps of the path. But we can also then incorporate the steps of the path, not only in our daily meditation, but also in between sessions. So in between sessions, when we continue this review of the steps of the path of enlightenment throughout the day, then we can still, at different points during the day, if your day is not completely hectic, you can pause and can still remind yourself of death and impermanence, and also the transient nature of our reality, that death might be upon us sooner rather than later, and then we have to do it again and again and again. And then think of the people around you that you come in contact with again and again and again, and try to find the commonalities between you and others in terms of, even though we act differently, speak differently, look differently, we have different priorities in life, still all of them are underpinned by this basic wish to be well, to be protected, to be satisfied, to be comfortable, and by the wish to be accepted, to be understood, to be happy, to be comfortable, to be surrounded by like-minded people and so forth. So although often we tend to dwell on the differences between ourselves and others, actually there are many more commonalities than differences. So we can then bring also the steps of the path of enlightenment and also refuge, not only in our meditation sessions, but in between meditation sessions. Particularly, I think that now when we look at what's been happening around the world in the last couple of years with COVID, then more recently with the floods in Australia, heavy rain, floods, then what's happening around the world in other places, Russia, Ukraine, and so forth. And I think that often we're looking forward for what will happen after those things go away. What will happen to us after COVID goes away? How great it will be. How great it will be when all those floods are gone, when people have cleaned their homes, rebuild their homes in one way or another, when the war in Ukraine and Russia will no longer be there, when things will be safer. But then, I keep on reminding myself that, that will go away and something else will happen. I mean, it's still, we live in samsara. So long as this basic samsaric state for us on an individual level is not solved, there's no certainty. Now we're kind of looking forward for what will happen at the end of the year, what will happen next year, and so forth. But I mean, it will still be samsara so long as we don't lift ourselves out of samsara. So in that sense, kind of, I still also bring refuge into also what occurs to me in between meditation sessions. Remind myself to not be too complacent with what I have now. So anything else before we conclude for today? All right. So hi, Barbara, by the way. Hi, Bob. It's Tetuna. So we will leave it off for now with doing a couple of dedication verses. In thinking that also, since it's the new year, new Tibetan year has started, and we also rely upon spiritual teachers such as His Holiness Dalai Lama and Lama Zopa Rinpoche. We also kind of wish them to have a happy new year, long life, best of health, and perfect conditions for the flourishing of the Dharma. So may the supreme jewel Bodhichitta that is not arisen arise and grow, and may that which is arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Now for His Holiness Dalai Lama, in the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chimrezi, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Savior of the Snowland teachings and transmigratory beings. This is another prayer for His Holiness Dalai Lama. So Savior of the Snowland teachings and transmigratory beings, who makes extremely clear the path that is unification of emptiness and compassion. To the Lotus Holder, Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And finally, also wishing a good year for Lama Zopa Rinpoche. You uphold the subduous moral way who serves in the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Majjhima's victorious doctrine. Who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please live long. All right, thank you.